Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
The Harvest Moon Affair, a Miss Marple mystery. Good evening, dear listeners. This is William, and you're tuning in to Mindful Musings, where we explore the curious corners of human nature and the mysteries that lie beneath the surface of everyday life. Tonight, I bring you a tale from the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a story witnessed through the keen eyes of a most remarkable woman, Miss Jane Marple. What began as a festive evening under a crimson moon ended in tragedy, and as always, Miss Marple saw what others missed. So settle in, dim the lights, and let me take you back to that fateful harvest dance, where the moon wasn't the only thing that turned red that night. Chapter 1. The Crimson Moon Rises. The village of St. Mary Mead had never looked more enchanting than it did on the evening of the harvest dance. Lanterns swayed from the rafters of the old barn, casting warm pools of amber light across the worn wooden floor. The scent of apple cider mingled with fresh hay, and the sound of fiddles filled the crisp autumn air. Miss Marple sat at a corner table, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the festivities with her characteristic gentle smile. "Such a lovely turnout this year," remarked Mrs. Bantry, settling into the chair beside her friend. "Even Thomas Aldridge has come, and you know how he detests these gatherings." Miss Marple's blue eyes flickered toward the dance floor where Thomas Aldridge, a sturdy farmer of some 50 years, moved awkwardly to the music with his wife Eleanor. "Indeed," she murmured. "Most unusual for him to attend. I believe this is the first harvest dance he's graced in nearly a decade." The moon outside had begun to rise, visible through the barn's high windows. It hung low and enormous, tinted a deep, unsettling red by some trick of atmosphere and dust. Several villagers paused to point and whisper about the phenomenon, calling it an omen or a blessing depending on their disposition. "Blood moon, they used to call it," said Dr. Haydock, appearing with 3 cups of cider balanced precariously in his hands. He distributed them to the ladies before taking a seat himself. "Nothing sinister about it, of course. Simply light refraction through atmospheric particles. Still, it does create quite a spectacle." Miss Marple accepted her cider with thanks, though she merely held it, watching as Thomas Aldridge excused himself from his wife and made his way toward the refreshment table. He looked flushed, she noted, and there was a tightness around his mouth that suggested displeasure or perhaps anxiety. His boots, heavy farming boots entirely inappropriate for a dance, left small traces of soil with each step. The fiddles struck up a livelier tune, and more couples took to the floor. Eleanor Aldridge stood alone for a moment before Robert Penrose, a younger farmer whose land bordered the Aldridge property, approached and offered his hand. She hesitated, glanced toward her husband, then accepted. "I see young Penrose has been doing well for himself," Dr. Haydock observed. "Expanded his holdings significantly this past year, I understand." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, her needles never ceasing their rhythm. "I believe there was some question about the boundary between his land and the Aldridge farm. Something about an old deed." Mrs. Bantry leaned in conspiratorially. "More than a question, Jane. Thomas claims Robert moved the fence posts during the spring planting. Been quite the feud brewing between them." Before Miss Marple could respond, Thomas Aldridge reached the cider barrel and poured himself a generous cup. He drank deeply, then reached for the ladle again. His hand trembled slightly, Miss Marple noticed, and his colour had gone from flush to something approaching grey. The music swelled. The red moon climbed higher, its eerie light streaming through the windows to mingle with the lantern glow. Thomas Aldridge set down his cup and turned toward the dance floor, perhaps intending to reclaim his wife from Robert Penrose's company. He managed 3 steps before his knees buckled. The fiddles screeched to a halt as Thomas crashed to the floor, convulsing once before going terribly still. Chapter 2. The Soil That Tells Tales. Chaos erupted in the barn as dancers scattered and voices rose in alarm. Dr. Haydock was the first to reach Thomas Aldridge, dropping to his knees beside the collapsed farmer with the practiced efficiency of a man who had seen too many emergencies. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands still on her knitting, but her eyes were sharp and watchful, taking in every detail of the scene before her. Eleanor Aldridge pushed through the crowd with a cry, Robert Penrose following close behind. She fell beside her husband, grasping his hand and calling his name, but Dr. Haydock gently pulled her back. "Give me space, Eleanor. Let me examine him." The doctor pressed his fingers to Thomas's neck, bent to listen at his chest, then sat back on his heels with a grave expression. "I'm afraid he's gone. Heart failure, most likely. The excitement of the evening, perhaps too much drink." "Nonsense," Eleanor gasped. "Thomas had a strong heart. He never complained of any ailment. This cannot be." Miss Marple rose from her chair and made her way quietly through the murmuring crowd. She approached the scene, not with morbid curiosity, but with the demeanour of someone who had observed that something was not quite right and intended to understand what it was. Her eyes didn't focus on Thomas's face or the grieving widow, but rather travelled downward to his boots. "Dr. Haydock," she said gently, "would you mind terribly if I made an observation?" The doctor looked up, surprised but respectful. "Of course not, Miss Marple." She gestured delicately toward Thomas's boots. "I couldn't help but notice the soil clinging to his footwear. That particular rich dark earth with the reddish clay undertones. It's quite distinctive." Robert Penrose frowned. "What does that matter at a time like this? The man has just died." "Indulge me, if you would, Mr. Penrose," Miss Marple continued in her mild voice. "You farm the land adjacent to the Aldridge property, do you not? What is the character of the soil in this area?" "Mostly sandy loam," Penrose replied curtly. "Some clay in the lower fields near the stream, but Thomas's land is all loam. Everyone knows that." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, "and yet the soil on his boots is predominantly clay. Red clay, to be specific. I noticed it earlier this evening when he was dancing. It seemed quite fresh, as though he had been walking through such earth very recently, perhaps even today." Constable Polk had arrived by this point, summoned from his nearby cottage. He was a large, ruddy-faced man who took his duties seriously, but was unaccustomed to dealing with anything more dramatic than a stolen chicken or a public disturbance. He looked down at the body with obvious discomfort. "Natural causes, Dr. Haydock?" he asked hopefully. The doctor hesitated. "I would have said so immediately, but Miss Marple has raised an interesting point. Thomas's symptoms, the sudden collapse, the convulsions, could be consistent with poisoning, though I can't be certain without a proper examination." Eleanor Aldridge let out a small cry. "Poisoning? Who would poison Thomas?" Miss Marple's gaze travelled around the circle of faces illuminated by lantern light. Fear, shock, and in one or two cases, something that might have been calculation. The red moon continued its ascent outside, indifferent to the tragedy it had witnessed. "Perhaps we should not jump to conclusions," Miss Marple suggested, "but I do think it would be wise for Constable Polk to ensure that no one leaves the barn until we've had a chance to ask a few questions. And Dr. Haydock, might I suggest you preserve that cider cup Thomas was drinking from, just as a precaution, you understand." Chapter 3. The Dance of Suspicions. Constable Polk positioned himself at the barn's main entrance, his considerable bulk ensuring that no one would slip past without his notice. The festive atmosphere had evaporated entirely, replaced by an uneasy tension that hung as thick as the hay dust in the air. Small groups formed and reformed as neighbours who had been laughing together moments ago now eyed each other with new wariness. Miss Marple returned to her corner table where Mrs. Bantry sat looking thoroughly shaken. "Jane, surely you don't really think someone poisoned Thomas Aldridge? At a village dance, of all places." "I think, Dolly, that when something appears unusual it bears examination. That soil on his boots troubles me." Miss Marple's fingers resumed their knitting, but her attention remained fixed on the scene before her. "Tell me, who arrived when this evening? I'm afraid I was so absorbed in conversation that I didn't notice everyone's entrance." Mrs. Bantry was happy to have something to focus on besides the sheet-covered form still lying on the floor. "Well, let me think. The Prices came early, they always do. Then the Weatherby sisters, giggling about something as usual. Robert Penrose arrived alone, I noticed. His wife is visiting her sister in London, or so he said. The Aldridges came quite late, actually. It must have been nearly 8 o'clock. And did they arrive together? Now that you mention it, no. Eleanor came in first, looking rather flustered. Thomas followed perhaps 10 minutes later. I remember thinking it odd that they hadn't come together when they live on the same property." Miss Marple filed this information away as Dr. Haydock approached their table, looking considerably more serious than when the evening had begun. "I've secured the cider cup and taken samples of what remained in the barrel. If this is poisoning, we'll need to send everything to a proper laboratory in London. The local facilities aren't equipped for this sort of analysis." "How long might that take?" Miss Marple inquired. "Several days at minimum. In the meantime, Constable Polk is insisting this is beyond his expertise. He's telephoned for Inspector Craddock from the county police." "Very sensible." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "Inspector Craddock is a most thorough young man. In the meantime, Dr. Haydock, what can you tell me about Thomas Aldridge's general health? You were his physician, were you not?" "For the past 20 years, Thomas was as healthy as a horse. No heart trouble, good constitution, never sick beyond the occasional cold. That's why this sudden collapse strikes me as so suspicious now that you've mentioned the possibility of poisoning. It simply doesn't fit his medical history." Across the barn, Eleanor Aldridge sat on a hay bale, surrounded by sympathetic neighbours offering comfort and pressed handkerchiefs. Her face was pale, her eyes red from weeping, but Miss Marple noticed that her gaze kept drifting toward Robert Penrose, who stood apart from the others, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Bantry," Miss Marple said quietly, "you're much better connected to village gossip than I am. Has there been any talk about Eleanor Aldridge and Robert Penrose?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Jane, you don't mean—" "Oh, but now that you mention it, I have heard whispers. Nothing substantial, you understand, just the sort of speculation that arises when a young wife seems unhappy in her marriage. Eleanor is 15 years younger than Thomas was, and he could be rather difficult, set in his ways, demanding. And Penrose is closer to her age, and unmarried until recently." "I see." Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her mind was working quickly, assembling pieces of a puzzle that was still mostly obscured. Chapter 4. The Missing Deed Surfaces. Inspector Craddock arrived shortly after 10 o'clock, a lean man in his early 40s with intelligent eyes and a methodical manner. Miss Marple had assisted him with a previous case, and he had learned to respect her observations, however improbable they might initially seem. After consulting with Dr. Haydock and Constable Polk, he made his way to Miss Marple's table. "Miss Marple, I understand you were the first to suggest this might not be natural causes." "I merely pointed out some inconsistencies, Inspector. The soil on Mr. Aldridge's boots, for instance. It doesn't match the earth on his own property, which suggests he was somewhere else today, somewhere with red clay soil." Inspector Craddock pulled out a small notebook. "And you believe this is significant?" "I believe everything is potentially significant until proven otherwise. There's been a boundary dispute between Thomas Aldridge and Robert Penrose. Disputes over land can inspire powerful emotions, particularly in farming communities where such things represent not just wealth, but heritage and identity." The inspector nodded slowly. "I'll need to question everyone who was present. Perhaps you might sit in, Miss Marple. Your insights could prove valuable." They began with Eleanor Aldridge, who had composed herself somewhat, though her hands still trembled as she twisted her handkerchief. Inspector Craddock was gentle but thorough in his questioning. "Mrs. Aldridge, can you tell me about your husband's activities today? Where was he? What was his mood?" Eleanor dabbed at her eyes. "He was agitated this morning. He received a letter, you see, from a solicitor in Ledbury. Something about the property boundary dispute with Robert Penrose. Thomas wouldn't tell me the details, but he was furious. He left the house around noon and didn't return until nearly 7:30. He wouldn't say where he'd been. And when he returned, how did he seem? Angry still, but also somehow satisfied, as though he'd accomplished something. He insisted we attend the dance, even though I knew he hated such events. He said—" She paused, swallowing hard. "He said he wanted to see Robert Penrose's face when he heard the news." "What news?" Inspector Craddock leaned forward. "I don't know. He wouldn't tell me. He just laughed in that unpleasant way he had when he thought he'd gotten the better of someone." Miss Marple spoke softly. "Mrs. Aldridge, had your husband been to the Penrose property recently? Perhaps walking the disputed boundary?" Eleanor looked surprised. "Not that I know of. The Penrose land borders ours to the east, but Thomas always said the boundary was clear. It was the western edge that was in dispute, where our property meets the old Wetherby farm." "The Wetherby farm?" Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. That's been abandoned for years, hasn't it? Yes, since old Mr. Weatherby died 5 years ago. His heirs have been trying to sell it, but there's been some confusion about the deed. Thomas mentioned it several times. He seemed to think... She stopped abruptly. Think what, Mrs. Aldridge? Inspector Craddock prompted. That he might have a claim to part of it. Something about a document his grandfather had signed with Mr. Weatherby's grandfather, a private agreement that preceded the official deed registration. Thomas had been searching for proof in our attic for months. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock exchanged glances. And had he found this document? The inspector asked. I believe he might have. 3 days ago, he came down from the attic looking triumphant. He had an old leather folder with him, but he wouldn't show me what was inside. Inspector Craddock made several notes. Where is this folder now? I don't know. Thomas kept it locked in his study desk. The inspector dispatched Constable Polk to the Aldridge home immediately to secure the study and locate the document. Then he turned his attention to Robert Penrose, who had been waiting with growing impatience. Chapter 5. The Clay Remembers. Robert Penrose sat rigidly in the chair opposite Inspector Craddock, his jaw set and his eyes defiant. He was a man of perhaps 35, weathered by outdoor work, but still possessing a certain rough handsomeness that Miss Marple noted Eleanor Aldridge had responded to earlier in the evening. Mr. Penrose, I understand you've had a boundary dispute with the deceased. Can you tell me about that? It wasn't a dispute. It was Thomas Aldridge making baseless accusations, Penrose said sharply. He claimed I'd moved fence posts on the eastern boundary of our properties. Complete nonsense. Those posts haven't been touched in 30 years. But you did expand your holdings recently? I purchased 20 acres from the old Simmons estate to the north of my property, completely legal and properly surveyed. Thomas was jealous because he'd wanted that land himself but couldn't meet the asking price. Miss Marple interjected gently. Mr. Penrose, have you had any interest in the Weatherby farm? His eyes flickered toward her. Anyone with sense would be interested. It's good land, well watered, but the deed situation is a mess. The heirs can't agree on anything, and there's been some question about whether old Weatherby actually owned all the acreage he claimed. Were you aware that Thomas Aldridge believed he had a claim to part of the Weatherby property? Penrose's expression darkened. He mentioned it at the pub 2 weeks ago, drunk and boasting about some ancient document that would prove his grandfather had been cheated. I didn't take it seriously. Thomas was always seeing conspiracies and injustices where none existed. Yet you invited his wife to dance this evening, Miss Marple observed mildly. It was a dance. I was being polite. Of course. Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking. Mr. Penrose, where were you this afternoon between noon and 7 o'clock? Working my own land, as I do every day. I was ploughing the south field, preparing for winter wheat. Alone? Yes, alone. My hired man is visiting his family in Wales this week. I see. Inspector Craddock made a note. And the soil in your south field, would you describe it as sandy loam or clay? Penrose frowned. Mostly loam, but there's a depression near the creek that's heavy clay. Red clay from the iron content. It floods in spring and turns into a muddy mess. Why? Just gathering information, Mr. Penrose. The inspector closed his notebook. That will be all for now, but please remain available for further questions. After Penrose left, Inspector Craddock turned to Miss Marple. You're thinking the clay on Aldridge's boots places him near that creek on Penrose's property? Not exactly, Inspector. You see, Mr. Penrose mentioned his hired man is away. If Thomas Aldridge walked through that clay-rich area near the creek, he did so either confronting Penrose or skulking about when Penrose was elsewhere. But there's another possibility that interests me more. Which is? The Weatherby farm borders both the Aldridge and Penrose properties, does it not? And it has been abandoned for 5 years. I wonder what condition the soil there might be in, particularly near the old farmhouse and outbuildings. Inspector Craddock's eyes lit with understanding. You think Aldridge was at the Weatherby farm today? I think it would be worth investigating. If he truly had found evidence of a claim to that property, he might have gone there to walk what he believed was rightfully his. And if someone knew he would be there... She didn't need to finish the sentence. A remote, abandoned farm would be an ideal location for a confrontation, or worse, for adding something deadly to a flask or bottle that Thomas Aldridge might carry with him. Chapter 6. The Wife's Secret. While Inspector Craddock organised a search party to examine the Wetherby farm at first light, Miss Marple turned her attention back to Eleanor Aldridge. The widow had been moved to a quieter corner of the barn, away from the curious stares and whispered speculations. Miss Marple approached with a cup of fresh tea, a gesture of comfort that had disarmed many a suspicious mind over her long years. "Mrs. Aldridge, I'm so terribly sorry for your loss. This must be dreadful for you." Eleanor accepted the tea with trembling hands. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I still can't believe it. One moment he was there, and then—" Her voice broke. Miss Marple settled into the chair beside her, her manner sympathetic but her eyes observant. "Forgive me for asking at such a difficult time, but I couldn't help noticing that you and your husband arrived separately this evening. Had there been some disagreement?" Eleanor's cheeks coloured slightly. "How did you—" "Yes, we had words. Thomas wanted me to wear a particular dress, one I've always hated. It was his mother's favourite colour, this dreadful puce that makes me look ill. I refused, and he stormed out saying he'd go alone. But then I felt guilty and came anyway, though I took my time about it." "I see. And in the time you were apart, did you have any idea where he might have—" "Gone?" "No. I assumed he came directly here, but he must have gone somewhere else first if he only arrived 10 minutes after I did." Miss Marple sipped her own tea thoughtfully. "Mrs. Aldridge, I hope you won't think me impertinent, but I've lived long enough to know that marriages can be complicated things. Was yours a happy union?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I suppose there's no point in pretending now. No, it wasn't happy. It hadn't been for years. Thomas was a good provider, but he was cold, controlling. He wanted a housekeeper and a farm manager, not a wife. I felt like one of his possessions, something to be directed and displayed when it suited him. Yet you stayed. Where would I go? I have no family, no money of my own. Thomas made sure of that. Everything was in his name, even the household accounts. I was trapped." She looked up suddenly, realization dawning on her face. "Oh, God, you think I might have killed him for the freedom?" "I'm not accusing you of anything, my dear. I'm simply trying to understand the situation." Eleanor set down her teacup with a sharp clink. "I won't lie to you, Miss Marple. I'm not sorry he's dead. These last years have been a prison, but I didn't kill him. I couldn't have. I was never near his cider cup, and besides, I wouldn't know the first thing about poisons." "What about Robert Penrose?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Has he been a comfort to you?" Eleanor's face went pale. "How did you—" "There's been nothing improper between us, I swear it. Robert has been kind, that's all. He understands what it's like to feel alone. His own marriage is unhappy. His wife cares more for London society than farm life. They barely speak to each other. But you've grown close. We've talked, that's all. At the village shop after church. Thomas noticed, of course. He accused me of terrible things, said Robert was trying to steal me along with his land. It was madness." Miss Marple nodded slowly, filing away each revelation. "One more question, if you don't mind. This document your husband found, the one concerning the Wetherby property. Did you ever see it? Could you describe it?" "I only glimpsed it once when Thomas left his study door ajar. It looked very old, written in brown ink on yellowed paper. There were official-looking seals at the bottom. That's all I saw before Thomas noticed me and locked it away again." Constable Polk returned at that moment with news that dampened the already sombre atmosphere. The Aldridge study had been found in disarray, the desk lock forced open, and the leather folder Eleanor had mentioned was nowhere to be found. Chapter 7. The Midnight Search. Inspector Craddock's face was grave as he absorbed Constable Polk's report. "You're certain it's been ransacked? Not simply untidy?" "Quite certain, sir. Drawers pulled out, papers scattered everywhere. Someone was looking for something specific, and they didn't care about being neat." "When could this have happened?" Miss Marple asked. "Surely not while everyone was here at the dance." "The Aldridge home is a good mile from the village, down that isolated lane. If someone left the dance briefly, claiming illness or some other excuse, they'd have had time to get there and back." Inspector Craddock immediately began checking who had been absent at any point during the evening. Several people had stepped outside for fresh air or to smoke, but most had remained in sight of others. However, Mrs. Bantry recalled that Robert Penrose had disappeared for perhaps 20 minutes around 7:30, claiming he needed to check on a mare he'd left tied outside. Though I remember thinking it odd, Mrs. Bantry added, because I didn't recall seeing him arrive with a horse. Most people walked from the village. Penrose was brought back for questioning, his earlier defiance replaced by barely controlled anger. Yes, I left for a short while. My mare had thrown a shoe earlier in the day, and I was concerned she might have developed a bruise. I walked her down the lane a bit to check her gait. I certainly didn't break into the Aldridge home. Can anyone verify that? Inspector Craddock asked. I was alone. It was dark, but I didn't go near the Aldridge property. Miss Marple spoke up from her corner. Inspector, might I suggest we wait until morning to search the Wetherby farm? I have a feeling that property holds more answers than we've yet discovered. Inspector Craddock agreed, though he insisted on posting Constable Polk at the Aldridge home for the remainder of the night. The dance attendees were finally allowed to leave, though the inspector made it clear that no one should plan on travelling far in the coming days. Miss Marple walked home through the quiet village streets, the red moon now high overhead, its colour faded to ordinary silver. The evening's events tumbled through her mind, each piece of information connecting to others in patterns both obvious and obscure. She thought of the soil, the missing deed, the unhappy marriage, the land dispute. And she thought of human nature, that most predictable of studies, with its eternal themes of greed, jealousy, and desperation. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple made herself a cup of cocoa and settled into her favourite chair, but not to sleep. Instead, she pulled out a pad of paper and began making notes, organising her thoughts. By the time dawn broke over St. Mary Mead, she had formed a theory that was still incomplete, but taking definite shape. At 8 o'clock, she telephoned Inspector Craddock. Inspector, before you search the Wetherby farm, I wonder if you might humour an old woman's curiosity about one small matter. Could you tell me who inherits Thomas Aldridge's property now that he's dead? There was a pause while the inspector consulted his notes. According to his solicitor, whom I spoke with late last night, everything goes to his wife Eleanor. There are no children, no other close relatives. I see. And if that missing document had proven valid, if Thomas had successfully claimed part of the Wetherby land, would that have passed to Eleanor as well? Presumably, yes. It would have been part of his estate. How very interesting, Miss Marple murmured. Inspector, I believe I would very much like to accompany you to the Wetherby farm this morning, if that's permissible. I promise not to get in the way. Chapter 8. The Wetherby Discovery. The Wetherby farm was a melancholy sight in the morning light. The farmhouse sagged on its foundations, its windows broken and its paint long since peeled away. Weeds had overtaken what had once been a kitchen garden, and the barn listed dangerously to one side. Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, and 2 constables picked their way carefully through the overgrown yard. Mind your step, the inspector warned. The whole place is a hazard. Miss Marple was less interested in the buildings than in the ground itself. She walked slowly, examining the earth, noting where red clay showed through patches where the grass had died back. Near an old well the clay was particularly prominent, and there, clear as could be, were boot prints hardened in what had been mud, but was now dried by yesterday's unseasonably warm afternoon. "Inspector, here!" she called. They gathered around the prints. They were fresh, no more than a day old, and they matched the size and tread pattern of Thomas Aldridge's farming boots. More importantly, they approached the well from the direction of a small stone outbuilding that might once have been a dairy or cold storage. He was definitely here, Inspector Craddock confirmed. Let's check that building. The outbuilding's door hung by one hinge. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of damp stone and rotting wood. Light filtered through cracks in the roof, illuminating a space that was surprisingly dry given the building's decrepit state. And there, on an old wooden shelf, sat a leather folder, precisely matching Eleanor Aldridge's description. Inspector Craddock carefully lifted it. Inside were several documents, the most prominent being a deed agreement dated 1847 between Jonathan Aldridge and Samuel Wetherby. The language was formal and archaic, but the meaning was clear. Jonathan Aldridge had loaned Samuel Wetherby a substantial sum to purchase an additional 40 acres adjacent to their properties. In exchange, if the loan was not repaid within 20 years, ownership of those 40 acres would revert to the Aldridge family. This could be worth a considerable sum, Dr. Haydock observed, reading over the inspector's shoulder. That land has road frontage. It could be developed. But is the document legally valid? Miss Marple asked. And was the loan ever repaid? That would require research into old records, Inspector Craddock said. But if Thomas Aldridge believed it was valid, and if someone else knew about it and wanted to prevent him from filing a claim, then they'd need to steal this document, Miss Marple finished. But Inspector, I'm puzzled. If someone stole the document from the Aldridge home last night, how did it end up here? Inspector Craddock frowned. You're right. That makes no sense. Unless... He examined the folder more closely. Miss Marple, there's dust on this shelf, quite thick, but the area where this folder was sitting is relatively clean. I'd say this has been here for a day at most. So, Thomas Aldridge brought it here yesterday, Miss Marple said slowly. But why? Why not keep it safely locked in his study? Dr. Haydock had been examining the other items on the shelf. Look at this. An old tin box, also relatively dust-free, and inside... He opened it carefully. A flask, silver, with the initials TA engraved on it, and it's still got liquid inside. Inspector Craddock took the flask with his handkerchief, opened it cautiously and sniffed. Whiskey, I'd say, or at least it smells like whiskey. We'll need to test it, Dr. Haydock said, if this is what poisoned him. Miss Marple had moved to the small window, looking out at the Weatherby farm and beyond to where the Penrose property was just visible through a line of trees. I believe, she said quietly, that Thomas Aldridge came here yesterday to do more than simply gloat over his discovery. He came to meet someone. Chapter 9. The Pattern Emerges. Back at the inspector's temporary headquarters in the village hall, the pieces were beginning to form a coherent picture, though not the one Inspector Craddock had initially expected. The laboratory analysis of the flask's contents confirmed the presence of a significant quantity of oleander extract, a poison that could easily be mistaken for heart failure if one wasn't looking for it. Oleander, Dr. Haydock explained to Miss Marple, is a common enough ornamental plant. Several households in the village grow it in their gardens. Attractive flowers, but deadly poisonous. Every part of the plant is toxic. Including the Penrose garden? Inspector Craddock asked pointedly. Among others, the Aldridges had several bushes by their front walk. So did the Weatherbys, though I imagine those have run wild by now. Miss Marple had been quiet, her fingers working her knitting needles in their steady rhythm. Now she looked up. Inspector, have you discovered who inherits the Weatherby property if the heirs sell? Who benefits from keeping that deed from being proven valid? The 3 Weatherby children are each equal heirs. They've been arguing about the sale for years. None of them lives locally anymore, but if Thomas Aldridge's claim were proven, it would complicate the sale considerably, possibly reducing the value of what they could sell. And Robert Penrose? Would the loss of those 40 acres affect his property value? Not directly. His land doesn't touch the disputed acres, but... The inspector consulted his notes. I did learn something interesting. Penrose has been negotiating to purchase the Weatherby farm from the heirs. He's offered substantially more than anyone else because he wants to consolidate the holdings into one large farm. If Aldridge's claim fragmented the property, the deal would likely collapse. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And yet, I don't believe Robert Penrose killed Thomas Aldridge. Both men stared at her. But he has the strongest motive, Inspector Craddock protested. His business arrangement threatened. His romantic interest in Eleanor Aldridge. Precisely, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Too many motives, too obvious, and the method doesn't suit him. Mr. Penrose is a straightforward man, perhaps quick to anger but not subtle. Poisoning requires planning, patience, and a certain cold-bloodedness. The person who did this understood human nature very well. Then who? Dr. Haydock demanded. Consider the sequence of events, Miss Marple said. Thomas Aldridge finds the deed. He's triumphant, eager to assert his claim. But first he wants to survey what he believes will be his property. So, yesterday afternoon he goes to the Weatherby farm. He brings his flask, perhaps intending to toast his good fortune. He leaves the deed there for some reason, and I believe I know why. Then he returns home, changes for the dance, and insists on attending an event he normally despises because he wants to see Robert Penrose's face when the news becomes public. But the deed was still at the Weatherby farm, Inspector Craddock said. He never got the chance to reveal it. Exactly. Because someone knew he would be at the Weatherby farm yesterday. Someone who had access to oleander, who knew Thomas well enough to predict his movements and who had the most to gain from his death. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked at them both. The person who ransacked the study last night wasn't looking for the deed. They already knew where it was. They were looking for anything else that might connect them to the murder, and they created that obvious scene of disorder to point suspicion elsewhere. Eleanor Aldridge, Dr. Haydock breathed. She inherits everything, Miss Marple confirmed, including the Weatherby claim if it proves valid. She gains her freedom from an unhappy marriage, and she has Robert Penrose waiting in the wings, whether or not he was aware of her plans. Inspector Craddock was already on his feet. But how did she poison the flask, and how did she know he'd be at the Weatherby farm? I suspect if you question her more carefully, you'll find that she knew about the deed before Thomas told her. Perhaps she overheard him making arrangements, or perhaps she was more observant than she pretended. As for the poison, I imagine she accessed his flask yesterday morning during their argument. She knew his habits, knew he carried it when walking the properties. She added the oleander extract, counted on him drinking from it at the Weatherby farm, and arranged to arrive late to the dance. Separately, so she'd have an alibi for the critical time period. But he didn't die at the farm, the inspector pointed out. He made it to the dance. Yes, and that nearly ruined her plan. Oleander can take time to act depending on the dose and individual constitution. Thomas must have had a stronger constitution than she anticipated, but once the symptoms began, she couldn't reverse course. She could only wait and hope that Dr. Haydock would rule it a heart attack, as he initially did. "Until you noticed the soil on his boots," Dr. Haydock said quietly. The soil told the story, Miss Marple agreed. It placed him at a location that raised questions, and once we began asking questions, the pattern emerged. It always does, in the end. Chapter 10. The Harvest Moonsets. Eleanor Aldridge was arrested the following morning. When confronted with Miss Marple's reconstruction of events, she initially maintained her innocence, but the evidence was overwhelming. The laboratory found traces of oleander in the study where she had prepared the extract. A witness came forward who had seen her walking toward the Weatherby farm the previous afternoon, though she'd claimed to have been home all day. Most damning, her fingerprints were found on the flask alongside her husband's. She finally confessed, though without remorse. "You can't possibly understand what it was like," she told Inspector Craddock. "Year after year of being treated like a servant, like property. Thomas controlled everything, what I wore, where I went, who I spoke to. When I found out about the Weatherby deed, I saw my chance. If he died before filing the claim, I'd inherit both properties. I'd be wealthy and free. I could finally live." "And Robert Penrose?" the inspector asked. Robert knew nothing about it. We were friends, that's all, though I hoped in time it might become more. But he would never have condoned murder. That was entirely my decision. She was tried at the county assizes 3 months later and convicted. The Weatherby deed was eventually validated, making the property Eleanor inherited substantially more valuable, though she would never benefit from it. The estate went to distant Aldridge cousins, who promptly sold everything to Robert Penrose, ironically giving him the consolidated farm he'd always wanted. Miss Marple sat in her cottage on a cold December evening, her knitting needles clicking as she reflected on the case. Mrs. Bantry had come for tea, eager to discuss every detail for the dozenth time. "I still can't believe it was Eleanor," Mrs. Bantry said, shaking her head. "She seemed so genuinely distraught." "Oh, I'm sure she was distraught," Miss Marple replied. Distraught that her carefully laid plan had gone awry when Thomas survived long enough to reach the dance. Distraught that questions were being asked. Human emotions are rarely simple, Dolly. Eleanor Aldridge was capable of both genuine grief and calculated murder. "We contain multitudes," as the poet said. "But how did you know it was her and not Robert Penrose? He seemed so obvious." "That's precisely why it wasn't him. In my experience, the obvious suspect is rarely the guilty party in cases of this complexity. Poison is a woman's weapon, they say, though I dislike such generalizations. But more than that, it was the pattern of behavior. Eleanor had the most to gain and the strongest motive, not passion or business rivalry, but escape from an intolerable situation. Trapped people do desperate things." "The poor woman," Mrs. Bantry said, then caught herself. though I suppose one shouldn't feel sorry for a murderess. One can feel sorry for the circumstances that led to the crime, while still condemning the crime itself, Miss Marple said gently. Thomas Aldridge was not a kind man. His treatment of his wife was cruel, if not criminal. But that never justifies taking a life. There are always alternatives, even if we can't see them in our darkest moments. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, the fire crackling in the grate. Outside, a new moon was rising, pale and innocent, nothing like the ominous red harvest moon that had witnessed Thomas Aldridge's last dance. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry said finally, "how do you always see these things? The rest of us were completely fooled." Miss Marple smiled her gentle smile. "I've lived a long time, my dear, and I've observed people carefully all those years. Human nature doesn't change, you know. The same patterns repeat endlessly: greed, jealousy, desperation, love, hate. Once you understand the patterns, once you learn to see past the surface, the truth becomes visible. It's rather like knitting, really. You follow the pattern, and eventually the picture emerges." She glanced down at her needles, which had produced several inches of an intricate pattern. "Of course, sometimes you have to unknit a few rows when you've made an error. The trick is recognizing the error before you've gone too far." "And you never make errors?" "Oh, I make them constantly," Miss Marple assured her. "But I try to correct them before they cause too much damage. That's all any of us can do." Mrs. Bantry rose to leave, pulling on her coat against the winter chill. At the door, she paused. "That red moon, Jane. Do you think it really was an omen after all?" Miss Marple considered the question. "I think the moon was simply the moon, doing what moons do. We humans are the ones who assign meaning to such things, who see omens and portents where there are only natural phenomena. The harvest moon didn't cause Thomas Aldridge's death any more than it causes the tides, but it witnessed it, as the moon has witnessed countless human tragedies throughout history, and it will continue to rise, red or pale, long after we're all gone." After Mrs. Bantry left, Miss Marple returned to her chair and her knitting, but her mind wasn't on the pattern before her. She was thinking about Eleanor Aldridge, sitting in a cold cell, her freedom, purchased at a terrible price. She thought about Thomas Aldridge, whose cruelty had ultimately brought about his own destruction, and she thought about the Wetherby farm, which had caused so much suffering over a question of ownership that now seemed almost trivial. The red harvest moon had indeed witnessed secrets that night, secrets of unhappiness, desperation, and murder. But it had also witnessed something else, the indomitable human capacity to see truth through deception, to piece together fragments of evidence into a coherent whole, and to ensure that justice, however imperfect, was served. Miss Marple finished her row of knitting, examined it critically, and nodded with satisfaction. The pattern was complete, every stitch in its proper place. Outside, St. Mary Mead settled into its winter peace, its secrets temporarily at rest, waiting for spring and whatever new mysteries it might bring. And so concludes our tale, dear listeners. The Harvest Moon Affair stands as a reminder that beneath the surface of even the quietest village, passions run deep and secrets fester in the darkness. Miss Marple, with her keen observation and understanding of human nature, brought light to those shadows and justice to a man who thought himself clever enough to commit the perfect crime, or rather, to a woman who believed her desperation justified her actions. This is William, signing off from Mindful Musings. Remember, the truth is always there, waiting to be discovered by those patient enough to see the patterns and brave enough to follow them to their conclusion. Until our next mystery, sleep well, and may your own secrets be harmless ones. Good night.